A school bus driver vanished without a trace while on his regular route in 1982, leaving the entire community searching for answers. But 18 years later, a farmer's plow hits something metal buried underground, and what he uncovers makes his blood run cold. The alarm clock's gentle buzz filled the sparsely furnished bedroom at precisely 5 o'clock. Robert Jennings opened his eyes immediately, as he had done every school day for the past 27 years. No need for a snooze button. Punctuality was not just a habit, but a cornerstone of his existence. The 55-year-old widower moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. The small kitchen in his apartment at 153 Elm Street offered just enough space for his modest needs. 2 slices of bread dropped into the toaster while he prepared his coffee, the same brand Martha had always bought. 5 years since cancer had taken her, yet he still reached for her favorite mug each morning. Robert spread blackberry jam, his favorite, over the warm toast, savoring the sweet tanginess as he gazed at Martha's photograph on the wall. Her eyes seemed to follow him around the room, a comforting presence in the solitude of his mornings. "Going to be mild today," he murmured to the empty room, checking the thermometer outside his window. He selected a thin sweater to wear beneath his impeccably ironed beige uniform. The school district's insignia gleamed on his breast pocket, freshly polished as always. Outside, the November air carried the scent of impending winter, though the temperature remained unseasonably gentle. Robert performed his habitual check of the apartment, lights off, coffee maker unplugged, door locked, before heading to his sedan. At the municipal garage, the clock read 5:45 when Robert signed the logbook. The night watchman nodded sleepily, accustomed to Robert's early arrivals. "Morning, Mr. Jennings. Bus 43's all fueled up and waiting." The yellow school bus sat in its designated spot, a beacon in the dim morning light. Robert circled it methodically, checking each tire with experienced eyes. He tested the lights, emergency exits, and brakes, recording each inspection point in careful handwriting on the district's form. Everything functioned perfectly, as he ensured it would every day. At 6:25, Robert settled into the driver's seat, adjusting mirrors already perfectly positioned. He placed his lunchbox, containing a sandwich and thermos of coffee, beside him, and switched on the radio to a low volume. The country station played Dolly Parton, Martha's favorite. At precisely 6:30, he turned the key and bus number 43 rumbled to life. The familiar streets of Millfield passed by his window as neighbors glanced at their watches, some even setting their clocks by his punctuality. "There goes Jennings," they'd say. "Must be 6:30 on the dot." His first stop came at 6:45. Emily Wilkerson stood at the end of her driveway, her Care Bears lunchbox clutched tightly against her pink coat. Her face brightened at the sight of the approaching bus. "Good morning, Emily," Robert greeted as the doors folded open. "How's that science project coming along?" "I finished it last night, Mr. Jennings," she beamed, climbing aboard. "Want to see the drawing I made of the solar system?" At the Mitchell farm, twins Tyler and Trevor bounded up the steps, arguing intensely about some new video game. Robert smiled, remembering when his own son Kevin had been that age, before Cincinnati and adulthood had claimed him. The bus continued its route through the rural outskirts of Athens County, stopping at the Miller property where 8-year-old Sarah waited. Her adoptive father, Gordon, stood on the porch, his wave strangely stiff. Robert noted the tension in the man's posture, filing it away in his mind as something to consider later. One by one, the remaining children boarded, the 3 Peterson siblings, quiet Tommy Collins with his Transformers lunchbox, shy Rebecca Johnson who always sat directly behind him, and Danny Park, whose Korean parents owned the town's only authentic Asian restaurant. The last pickup came at 7:15 when Alice Thompson climbed aboard at the boundary between the Harrington and Collins farms. Robert checked his watch, right on schedule, and merged onto the main road toward Millfield Elementary. The children chatted among themselves, creating the comfortable backdrop of noise that had become the soundtrack to Robert's life since Martha's passing. These kids were more than passengers. They were his purpose. He knew each birthday, each pet's name, each favorite subject or fear. In his glove compartment, he kept every drawing they had ever given him, organized by date. The bus wound through the countryside, the familiar landscape rolling by as Robert mentally calculated their arrival time. 7:45 at the school, as always. The radio played softly as he navigated a curve on Route 16, noticing the way the morning mist still clung to the fields. As the sun broke through the November clouds, the Assistant Sheriff Doug Wilson was already responding to the first call about Bus 43. His cruiser sped along the route, sirens silent but lights flashing. At 9:23, his radio crackled to life as he discovered the abandoned vehicle. "I found the bus," he reported, his voice trembling. "Secondary Road 16, near the turnoff to Harrington Farm. Engine running, doors open, there's nobody inside. I repeat, the bus is empty." Sheriff Mackenzie stared at the crumpled paper in his hands, his weathered face paling under the harsh fluorescent lights of Bus 43. In the glove compartment, amid children's drawings and maintenance logs, he'd found something that changed everything. A hand-drawn map of the Miller property, with the word shelter circled in red ink. In the corner, unmistakably, was Gordon Miller's handwriting. Dawn broke on November 18th with a chill that hadn't been present the previous day. Volunteers gathered in front of the town hall, their breath forming clouds in the morning air, as Mayor Richardson distributed maps of Athens County, each sectioned into search grids. "We cover every inch," the mayor instructed, his voice strained from a sleepless night. "Every barn, every ditch, every abandoned building." Meanwhile, Sheriff Mackenzie stood on the Miller's front porch, watching Gordon's face carefully as he presented the discovered map. "Care to explain this, Gordon?" he asked, holding the paper between them like evidence. Gordon's fingers trembled slightly as he took the map. "It's nothing suspicious," he said, his voice higher than usual. "There's an old Cold War bomb shelter on the property. I drew this for Robert weeks ago, thought it might help as a landmark for the route." Behind Gordon, Elizabeth Miller appeared in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She glanced between her husband and the sheriff, worry etching deeper lines around her mouth. "The shelter's been there since the 50s, Gordon continued, pointing vaguely toward the back of his property. "My father-in-law built it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I just mentioned it to Robert as a reference point, that's all." At the sheriff's office, Kevin Jennings spread his father's papers across the desk. Calendars, notebooks, utility bills, searching for anything unusual. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. "Dad kept records of everything," he muttered to Deputy Wilson, who watched sympathetically. "There has to be something here." Kevin paused over a recent note in his father's meticulous handwriting. Gordon asking odd questions about route timing. Check with school administration? The date marked was just 10 days earlier. Across town, search parties with bloodhounds traversed cornfields stripped bare by the recent harvest. Volunteers formed long human chains, walking slowly through undergrowth, calling names that echoed unanswered across the landscape. In the school gymnasium, transformed into an emergency center, Mary Collins sat motionless, clutching Tommy's favorite jacket. Social workers offered food, water, blankets. She registered none of it, her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting her son to walk through at any moment. "Why aren't you looking at Gordon Miller more seriously?" Jim Peterson demanded, confronting Sheriff Mackenzie when he returned to check on the families. "My kids could be anywhere by now, and you're wasting time on some wild goose chase." The sheriff's response was cut short by the arrival of the first national news van, parking conspicuously in front of Millfield's only hotel. The tragedy was no longer just theirs. America was watching now. Following his conversation with the sheriff, Gordon Miller hurriedly left his house, claiming he needed to run errands in Columbus. He didn't notice the unmarked police car that pulled out behind him, maintaining a careful distance as he drove toward the state capitol. As dusk settled over Millfield, FBI agents Parker and Lowenthal arrived, their black SUV parting the crowd of onlookers. They quickly established a command center, bringing in satellite communications equipment and computer systems that seemed alien in the small-town sheriff's office. "We treat this as both a missing persons case and a potential crime scene," Agent Parker explained, examining the abandoned bus with a powerful flashlight, collecting dust samples from the seats and floor. Meanwhile, Agent Lowenthal interviewed the garage supervisor, a balding man named Frank, who couldn't stop wringing his hands. "Bus was in perfect condition," Frank insisted. "Robert wouldn't have left if anything was wrong. He was more careful than our mechanics." In the growing darkness, Kevin stood before the wall of photographs in the sheriff's office. 10 school pictures and his father's driver's license photo enlarged and printed earlier that day. His attention fixed on Sarah Miller's image, the only child not smiling. Instead, her eyes held something Kevin couldn't quite define. Wariness, perhaps, or fear. He traced his finger over Sarah's photo, then over his father's. "What did you see, Dad?" he whispered. "What were you trying to figure out?" At midnight, the office phone rang with a sharpness that made everyone jump. Sheriff Mackenzie answered, his face growing increasingly grave as he listened to the detective who had followed Gordon Miller to Columbus, reporting that the man had not visited any medical facility, as he'd told his wife, but had spent 3 hours in the Ohio State Library researching articles about people who disappeared without leaving traces. Sheriff Mackenzie stared at the phone, his knuckles white against the receiver. "The library? You're certain?" After hanging up, he turned to face the crowded office, his expression grim. Gordon Miller spent 3 hours researching disappearances, not medical appointments like he told his wife. The morning of November 19th dawned clear and cold. Agent Lowenthal of the FBI sat across from Gordon Miller in the small interrogation room of the Millfield Sheriff's Office, while Agent Parker observed through the one-way mirror. The atmosphere was tense, the fluorescent lights harsh against Gordon's pallid face. "Your employment history shows you worked for Williams & Sons Construction from 1976 to 81, Lowenthal stated, sliding a document across the table. "As an engineering assistant." Gordon nodded stiffly. "That was before I met Elizabeth. What does this have to do with finding Sarah?" "You have knowledge of structural engineering, excavation techniques, construction equipment," Lowenthal continued, ignoring the question. "And yesterday, instead of visiting a doctor as you told your wife, you researched disappearances." Gordon's eyes darted nervously. "I just wanted to understand what might have happened to Sarah, to all the children. Wouldn't any parent?" Meanwhile, Kevin Jennings and Sheriff Mackenzie followed the newly discovered dirt path connecting the road where the bus was found to the Harrington farm. The property belonged to an elderly man who had been hospitalized for months in Columbus. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud, disappearing abruptly at a clearing surrounded by overgrown fields. "Someone drove through here recently," the sheriff noted, crouching to examine the depth of the tracks. "Heavy vehicle by the look of it." Kevin's mind flashed to an entry in his father's diary from 3 weeks earlier. "Gordon Miller approached me after school today, asked strange questions about the route, exact timing of stops, said he was concerned about Sarah's long wait time. Something feels off." Back at the FBI's temporary headquarters, Agent Parker reviewed the Miller divorce proceedings, highlighting passages where Elizabeth accused Gordon of controlling behavior. The file contained photographs documenting their relationship, including one from their wedding day showing 3-year-old Sarah standing between them, her small hand clutched in Gordon's. "He's not her biological father," Parker noted to Lowenthal when he returned. "Married Elizabeth when Sarah was 3. Divorce filing indicates Elizabeth planned to relocate with Sarah to Michigan after the proceedings." That evening, Elizabeth Miller sat in a private room at the sheriff's office, tears streaming down her face as she revealed disturbing details about Gordon's recent behavior. "He installed locks on her bedroom door last month," she whispered, hands trembling around a tissue. "Said it was to keep her safe, but the locks were on the outside. I confronted him, and he said I was being paranoid." Outside the sheriff's office, tension was mounting. Jim Peterson had gathered a dozen men from the factory where he worked, their faces hard with anger and fear. "We want answers," Jim shouted at Sheriff Mackenzie. "Gordon Miller should be charged. Our children are out there somewhere." Across the street, Mary Collins stood alone, her voice quiet but firm as she defended Gordon to a neighbor. He's always been kind to Tommy, always asked about his schoolwork. This isn't right. The search intensified when volunteers discovered Rebecca Johnson's lunchbox, partially buried near the path to the Harrington farm. The pink plastic container, decorated with unicorn stickers, reignited hope among the search parties. Forensic technicians carefully excavated and examined the item, finding only Rebecca's fingerprints, no other traces. As Gordon returned home after hours of questioning, neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispers spreading through the community like wildfire. The unity of the first day had fractured into suspicion and blame. Kevin spent the evening sorting through his father's belongings, discovering an old key with a faded label reading "Shelter," eerily similar to the reference on Gordon's map. This couldn't be coincidence. Late that night, Agent Parker placed a call to the hospital in Columbus, where Mr. Harrington was recovering from hip surgery. The elderly man sounded confused about dates and times, but one statement caught Parker's attention. "There was construction on my property recently," Harrington said haltingly. "Heard the machines when my nephew visited. Thought it strange, since I hadn't authorized any work." At midnight, while Millfield finally fell into an uneasy silence, Agent Lowenthal received an urgent call from the FBI laboratory. The analyst's voice crackled with tension over the speaker. "We've identified the fibers found on the bus floor," she reported. "They contain traces of ketamine, a powerful veterinary sedative, and county records show Gordon Miller purchased this exact compound 2 weeks ago from a clinic in Columbus, claiming he needed it for humane livestock euthanasia." Agent Lowenthal slammed down the phone, his face grim. "We need a warrant for Miller's arrest now. He purchased ketamine 2 weeks ago, the same sedative found on the bus." Dawn broke on November 20th, with a flurry of activity as FBI agents and local police surrounded the Miller residence. Sheriff Mackenzie led the approach, warrant in hand, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. The silence that greeted their knock was unnerving. "Gordon Miller, this is Sheriff Mackenzie. We have a warrant," he called, waiting several seconds before signaling to an officer to break down the door. Elizabeth Miller appeared in the doorway, her nightgown crumpled, eyes wide with panic. "He's not here," she stammered. "He said he needed to check something at work around 2 this morning. I thought he'd be back soon." The search team swept through the house while Agent Parker gently led Elizabeth to the living room. "Did he say anything specific before leaving?" he asked. "No, just that he had to verify something," she whispered, pulling her robe tighter. "Is this about Sarah? Have you found her?" In the basement, an agent called out, "Sir, you need to see this." Behind a false wall, they discovered a small workspace containing detailed plans of the Harrington farm, areas marked in red, alongside a nearly empty vial of ketamine. Elizabeth collapsed when shown the hidden room. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "He said he was building shelves down there. How could I not know?" Meanwhile, Kevin Jennings and Sheriff Mackenzie pored over old maps at the Millfield Library, searching for clues about the Cold War shelters Robert had mentioned years ago. "Dad talked about farmers building bunkers during the 50s, Kevin explained, tracing his finger along a faded county survey. "He specifically mentioned Harrington's elaborate bunker once when I was a teenager." Search teams with heavy equipment converged on the Harrington farm by mid-morning. Engineers used ground-penetrating radar to scan for underground structures, while helicopters with thermal imaging cameras circled overhead. At the farm's entrance, national news crews set up camp, broadcasting live updates. The small town of Millfield, Ohio, lives in terror as the search for 11 missing persons enters its 4th day. A reporter intoned gravely into her microphone. Jim Peterson arrived with a group of parents, their faces hardened with determination. "Those are our children down there," he shouted at an officer trying to maintain the perimeter. "We're helping with this search." After brief consultation, Agent Lowenthal allowed the parents to join certain search teams, understanding that keeping them away would be impossible. Elizabeth sat in the command center, receiving comfort from Mary Collins, 2 mothers united by unimaginable circumstances. "I never imagined," Elizabeth whispered, How did I not see what he was planning? We see what we expect to see, Mary replied softly, holding Elizabeth's hand. No one blames you. By afternoon, engineers identified several anomalies beneath the soil near an abandoned barn. The density readings suggest a large void approximately 6 feet below surface level, a technician explained, pointing to a computer screen displaying multicolored imagery. Search dogs brought to the area circled excitedly, barking at the ground inside the barn's perimeter. Forensic technicians collected soil samples, confirming traces of the same sedative found on the bus. Kevin watched the proceedings with growing dread. The reality of what they might find was becoming impossible to ignore. My father would have fought to protect those kids, he told Sheriff Mackenzie, who nodded silently. As sunset approached, powerful floodlights were installed around the barn area. The excavation would continue through the night, time becoming increasingly precious with each passing hour. Elizabeth identified tools found at the site as belonging to Gordon. He kept them in the garage, she confirmed. He knows how to use them all. He worked construction before I met him. Night fell over Millfield, but the Harrington farm blazed with activity. Excavators carefully removed layers of soil while structural engineers monitored the process to prevent collapse. At 10:17, the quiet rhythm of digging was interrupted by a metallic clang. The excavator operator immediately shut down his machine and called for the supervisors. When floodlights illuminated the freshly dug pit, a yellow metallic reflection gleamed in the darkness. The roof of a school bus buried nearly 6 feet below ground. A hush fell over the crowd as the yellow metal gleamed under the floodlights. Agent Lowenthal raised his hand, halting all movement around the excavation site. "Nobody touches anything," he commanded through his radio. "This is now a recovery operation. I want structural engineers front and center." Dawn broke on November 21st, with dozens of officials surrounding the pit where the buried school bus had been discovered. Engineers in hard hats carefully directed the removal of soil around the vehicle, reinforcing the walls of the excavation to prevent collapse. The process was agonizingly slow, each shovelful of dirt removed with the precision of an archaeological dig. Agent Lowenthal coordinated the operation from a makeshift command post, insisting on methodical documentation. "This is a crime scene," he reminded the team. "Every inch matters, every detail needs to be preserved." By mid-morning, the first window of the bus became fully visible. The gathered officials fell silent as flashlight beams penetrated the dirt-streaked glass, revealing the shadowy outlines inside. Several officers turned away, their expressions confirming what everyone feared. Paramedics stood by with stretchers and equipment, their initial readiness giving way to resigned professionalism as word spread quietly through the ranks that they would be recovering bodies, not survivors. Sheriff Mackenzie broke protocol, pushing past the FBI perimeter to see for himself. Agent Parker moved to stop him, but relented at the sight of the sheriff's face, a man who had aged years in days. Looking through the cleared window, Mackenzie's shoulders slumped visibly, the last ember of hope extinguished. Kevin Jennings received the news from Agent Parker, who delivered it with quiet compassion away from the cameras that had gathered at the farm's perimeter. Kevin sank to his knees in the cold mud, his hands covering his face. He was trying to save them, he whispered through his fingers, until the very end. Within the hour, Mary Collins arrived at the scene. Her neighbor's sedan barely stopped before she leaped out, running toward the excavation. 2 deputies intercepted her, holding her back as she screamed Tommy's name, her voice echoing across the silent farm. Jim Peterson stood by his pickup truck, methodically punching its hood until his knuckles split and bled, deaf to the pleas of other parents trying to calm him. His rage had nowhere else to go. By early afternoon, medical examiners had established a protocol for removing the victims. Each body was treated with extraordinary care, placed on a stretcher under a sheet, and carried through a corridor of solemn officers standing at attention. Inside the bus, investigators documented the final moments of 11 lives. Robert Jennings was found at the wheel, one hand stretched toward the emergency door release. The children remained in their seats, some with heads resting on backpacks as if they had decided to take a nap. There were no signs of struggle or trauma, just stillness. Forensic technicians carefully cataloged personal items: Robert's wedding ring that had never left his finger since Martha's death, Tommy Collins' turtle pin received for his birthday the previous week, Rebecca Johnson's diary with its final entry about "a strange dream I had yesterday." Elizabeth Miller identified tools found in the bus as belonging to Gordon, confirming between sobs that he possessed the technical knowledge necessary for the modifications investigators had discovered in the vehicle's ventilation system. These modifications, as the forensic engineer explained to Agent Lowenthal, had been designed to redirect carbon monoxide from the engine into the passenger compartment, a deliberate, calculated method of incapacitation. By evening, Sheriff Mackenzie and Agent Lowenthal held an impromptu press conference at the farm's entrance. Their grim faces told the story before they spoke a word. "All 11 victims have been recovered," the sheriff confirmed, his voice breaking. "Gordon Miller is now wanted for multiple homicide." Kevin sat alone in his father's apartment that night, sorting through the personal effects returned to him by the FBI. Among them was a crumpled paper where Robert had begun writing. "Something odd with Gordon. Too many questions about the route. Need to check." As investigators reconstructed Gordon Miller's final movements, they discovered records of concrete purchases and construction materials acquired weeks before, using his old employee number from the construction company. The evidence painted a picture of meticulous planning that chilled even the most experienced agents. While the final body was removed from the site shortly before midnight, the sheriff's office received an emergency call that would bring the manhunt to an unexpected conclusion. A farmer 20 miles away had discovered a man hanging in his barn with a confession note pinned to his chest. "I couldn't let them take Sarah from me. Where she goes, I will follow." The farmer's voice trembled over the phone line as he described the grim discovery in his barn. "He's just hanging there. Left a note. I didn't touch anything else." Dawn broke on November 22nd with investigators photographing and documenting the suicide scene. Gordon Miller's body swayed slightly in the morning breeze that filtered through the barn's wooden slats, while technicians carefully collected evidence around the scene. His face, now ashen and still, betrayed nothing of the torment that had driven him to such horrific acts. Agent Parker carefully removed the multi-page suicide letter pinned to Gordon's chest, placing each sheet in an evidence bag. The handwriting was meticulous, almost scholarly, contrasting sharply with the disturbing content. "They wanted to take Sarah from me. This world is too dangerous for her. Where we go, we will all be family." The letter continued for several pages, detailing delusions about an impending societal collapse and his self-appointed mission to save the children from it. At the county morgue, Elizabeth identified her husband's body with a barely audible, "Yes, it's him," before collapsing into Agent Parker's arms. The woman who just days ago had been a normal mother in a small town now found herself cast as the wife of a monster, a role no one could prepare for. Kevin spent the morning alone in his father's apartment, methodically searching through drawers and cabinets, seeking to understand his father's final days. Each mundane discovery, a shopping list, a receipt for oil change, a library book on gardening, felt like a precious artifact from a life abruptly severed. The medical examiner briefed investigators that afternoon, explaining that the victims had likely been sedated first through the ventilation system, before carbon monoxide rendered them unconscious and ultimately caused their deaths. They would have become drowsy, perhaps confused briefly, then simply fallen asleep, he explained clinically. There would have been minimal distress. This detail provided a strange comfort to Mary Collins when Sheriff Mackenzie gently relayed it to her. "He didn't feel fear then," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Tommy just fell asleep." Her hands trembled less as she arranged his toy robots on the coffee table, as if this knowledge had loosened grief's grip slightly. Meanwhile, Main Street had transformed into a media circus. News vans blocked traffic, Reporters delivered live updates from the town square, and satellite dishes sprouted like strange mechanical flowers atop trucks. Local residents took alternate routes to avoid the cameras, many staying home altogether. At Winters' funeral home, the oldest business in Millfield, Richard Winters spoke solemnly with families about arrangements. "Never prepared so many," he confided to his assistant after the Peterson family left. "Never thought I'd see something like this in our town." Jim Peterson confronted Sheriff Mackenzie that evening outside the police station. "Why didn't you arrest him sooner?" he demanded, jabbing a finger at the sheriff's chest. "You knew it was him, and you let him kill himself." His anger, fueled by grief and helplessness, echoed what many in the community were thinking. Alone in his office later, Mackenzie reviewed the investigation timeline, marking critical decision points with a red pen. Each mark represented a moment when different choices might have been made, a visual representation of the guilt he carried. Kevin found himself on Elizabeth Miller's porch that evening, neither quite sure how they'd ended up in each other's company. They sat in silence for nearly an hour before Elizabeth spoke. "Sarah loved when your father would stop the bus to show the children deer or rare birds," she said softly. She'd come home full of stories about Mr. Jennings' nature lessons. Investigators combing through Sarah's bedroom discovered dozens of drawings hidden under her mattress, depicting Gordon as a dark, looming figure. Her teacher delivered an unsettling essay Sarah had written weeks before. "Sometimes I'm afraid to go home, but I can't say why." These revelations painted a portrait of a child silently crying for help in the only ways she knew how. Forensic psychologists analyzing Gordon's writings explained to the investigation team that his delusions followed recognizable patterns of paranoid fixation. "He genuinely believed he was protecting these children," explained Dr. Hannigan. "In his mind, he was saving them from a world he perceived as irredeemably dangerous." In his father's apartment, Kevin discovered an envelope addressed to him containing application forms for a gardening course and a note in Robert's neat handwriting. "Perhaps we could do this together in spring." The simple message of hope for a future that would never come broke something in Kevin that even the identification of his father's body had not. The night before the funerals, as Millfield prepared for its darkest day, Agent Lowenthal received a disturbing call from the FBI laboratory. The fingerprints found on the modified ventilation system of the bus didn't match Gordon Miller's, suggesting he might not have acted alone. Agent Lowenthal stared at the fingerprint report in disbelief. "This complicates everything," he muttered, reaching for his phone to assemble the team for an emergency briefing. The possibility of an accomplice sent shockwaves through the investigation. By dawn, on November 23rd, the FBI had compiled a comprehensive list of Gordon Miller's associates, focusing particularly on his former colleagues from the construction company and anyone with access to heavy equipment. "We need to interview everyone he had contact with in the months leading up to the crime," Agent Parker instructed her team. "Focus on anyone with engineering knowledge or access to the school bus garage." Meanwhile, Millfield's Methodist Church overflowed with mourners. The parking lot filled hours before the service, forcing attendees to park along the highway for nearly a mile. Outside, thousands gathered holding yellow balloons in tribute to the school bus that had become a symbol of the tragedy. Inside, 11 caskets lined the altar, 1 large and 10 small, each covered with flowers and children's drawings. The sight brought even the most stoic townspeople to tears. Mary Collins approached Tommy's casket with steady steps, gently placing his Transformers lunchbox on top. "For case he gets hungry in heaven," she whispered, touching the polished wood one last time before taking her seat. Kevin Jennings stood at the pulpit, his hands trembling as he faced the congregation. For a moment, it seemed he might falter, but then his shoulders straightened. "My father lived to see children safely to the school gate," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. His final act was trying to reach that emergency door, trying to save them until his last breath. That was who Robert Jennings was, a man who put others before himself every single day. While Millfield mourned, FBI agents in Detroit located Lewis Harrington, the 37-year-old nephew of the farm's owner and an equipment operator by trade. The agents found him at his apartment, completely unaware of the events that had unfolded in his uncle's property. "Gordon Miller?" Louis repeated when shown the photograph, recognition dawning on his face. "Yeah, I did some excavation work for him a few weeks back. He said it was a personal project, a shelter for his family." The interrogation room grew tense as Louis gradually understood his unwitting role in the tragedy. "He paid me in cash," he explained, producing receipts labeled as consulting services from his filing cabinet. "Said it needed to be done quickly and discreetly. I thought maybe he was building without permits, not this." Agents reviewed footage from Lewis's phone, showing him operating an excavator on the Harrington property, digging what he believed was a foundation for an underground shelter, while Gordon supervised carefully from the edge of the pit. Back in Millfield, investigators uncovered medical records revealing that Gordon Miller had been hospitalized for psychotic episodes at 19 and again at 22, with a diagnosis of delusional disorder. Elizabeth collapsed when shown these records. "He told me the gaps in his education were because he had to work to pay for college," she whispered, her world unraveling further with each revelation. Everything was a lie. At the cemetery, 11 freshly dug graves awaited in the cold November soil. The community stood in silence as the caskets were lowered, parents supporting each other regardless of past differences. Kevin and Jim Peterson stood side by side, the grieving father's hand resting on the shoulder of the man who had lost his father. Later that afternoon, investigators examined photographs of the barn's construction in December 1982, noting how it had been strategically positioned directly above where the bus had been buried. The building permit, filed by Gordon, specified a storage structure for farm equipment, a perfect cover for what lay beneath. Lewis Harrington arrived in Millfield that evening, visibly shaken as agents asked him to reconstruct the timeline of his work at the farm. "I had no idea," he repeated, staring at the excavated pit where the bus had been found. He seemed so normal, maybe a bit intense about specifications, but nothing that raised red flags. Agent Lowenthal concluded that while Lewis had provided critical technical assistance, all evidence suggested he had no knowledge of Gordon's criminal intent. "He was used," Lowenthal told Sheriff Mackenzie, "just another victim of Miller's manipulation." After the funeral, when most mourners had departed and only family members remained at the cemetery, Elizabeth Miller approached Kevin quietly. From her purse, she withdrew a worn, leather-bound book. "I found this hidden in Gordon's toolbox in the garage," she said, her voice barely audible as she placed it in Kevin's hands. "It's his personal diary. There's an entry from 2 weeks before it happened that begins, 'Robert Jennings is growing suspicious of me. I must act before he speaks to the authorities.'" Kevin stared at the diary in his hands, the leather binding worn smooth from frequent handling. "He knew my father suspected something," he whispered, the weight of this revelation settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The morning after the funeral, Agent Lowenthal assembled his team at the sheriff's office to examine Gordon's diary. Pages were carefully laid out on the conference table, creating a disturbing timeline of mental deterioration. FBI psychologists pointed to specific entries showing a progressive disconnect from reality. "Look at this entry from 6 months ago," Agent Parker said, pointing to a neatly written paragraph. "Sarah said she enjoys riding the school bus because Mr. Jennings tells funny stories. He seems like a good man for the plan." He was already considering Robert as part of whatever scenario he was constructing. Sheriff Mackenzie's finger traced along to an entry from 3 weeks before the disappearance. "Jennings watched me today, when I visited the garage, asked questions about what I was doing near the buses. He suspects." The garage supervisor, Frank Donahue, confirmed to Agent Parker that Gordon had volunteered to help with minor repairs in the months leading up to the disappearance. "Said he wanted to contribute to the community," Frank explained, removing his cap to wipe his brow. "We were short-staffed, so I didn't think twice about it." The visitor log from the municipal garage revealed Gordon had been there 3 times in the week before the disappearance, always during lunch hours when the main mechanic was away. Security camera footage, grainy and intermittent, showed glimpses of Gordon working under the hood of Bus 43, installing what investigators now understood was a homemade device connected to the engine. At Millfield Elementary, teachers welcomed students back with brave faces that barely concealed their grief. In each classroom affected by the tragedy, empty chairs stood decorated with flowers and photographs of the missing children, silent monuments to lives cut short. Kevin spent those days in his father's apartment, methodically sorting through Robert's possessions. In the closet, he discovered a cardboard box containing every drawing Robert had received from his young passengers over the years, each one carefully dated and preserved. Across town, Mary Collins maintained her ritual of cleaning Tommy's room, changing his sheets weekly, dusting his model airplanes. Neighbors watched with silent concern as she arranged his school books on his desk, as if expecting him to return for homework. Jim Peterson converted his garage into an improvised office for the newly formed Millfield Children's Foundation, with phone lines being installed and volunteers setting up filing cabinets. His wife Janet answered calls from other communities offering support, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. Elizabeth Miller packed her belongings into cardboard boxes, unable to remain in the house she had shared with Gordon. "Every corner holds memories I can't bear," she explained to Kevin when he came to help. Sarah's toys, her clothes, knowing he planned it all while living here with us. At the elementary school, children created condolence cards for the families. A small girl with pigtails carefully wrote to Mary Collins, "Tommy was my friend. He always shared his colored pencils." Teachers fought back tears as they collected these innocent expressions of grief. Sheriff Mackenzie announced his early retirement in a brief statement to the press gathered outside the department. "I failed this community in ways I can never repair," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. His successor would inherit a town forever changed. At dusk, Kevin visited his father's grave, placing the rose that Robert had faithfully brought to Martha's resting place every Sunday. "I'll continue for you, Dad," he promised, his words carried away by the evening breeze. Lewis Harrington, devastated by his unwitting role in the tragedy, approached the town council with an offer to completely dismantle the barn and create a proper memorial at the site. "It's the least I can do," he said, his voice breaking. "Those families deserve a place to remember." As the town slowly began its long healing process, a state police detective knocked on Kevin's door one evening, his expression grave. "Mr. Jennings, I need to speak with you about something disturbing we've discovered," he said as Kevin invited him in. "While reviewing old unrelated cases, we found that Gordon Miller wasn't a real name. It was an identity assumed 15 years ago by Gerald Mosley, a man with a history of psychiatric hospitalizations who disappeared from an Indiana facility after being implicated in a nurse's death." Kevin stared at the detective, trying to process this new revelation. "Gerald Mosley?" he repeated, the unfamiliar name feeling strange on his tongue. "Are you absolutely certain?" "Fingerprint analysis confirmed it," the detective replied, laying out a folder containing mugshots of a younger Gordon Miller, or rather Gerald Mosley, his face leaner, but the eyes unmistakably the same. He disappeared from Oak Ridge Psychiatric Hospital in Indiana in 1967 after being questioned about a nurse's death. The following morning, FBI agents in Indianapolis retrieved dusty archives from storage facilities, spreading decades-old case files across conference tables. Photographs of a young Gerald showed the unmistakable features that would later belong to the man Millfield knew as Gordon Miller. The resemblance was chilling. Same deep-set eyes, same prominent brow, only lacking the lines that years would eventually etch into his face. Agent Lowenthal studied a psychiatric report from 1967, its yellowed pages detailing Mosley's delusions about saving innocent children from the impending apocalypse and his obsession with underground shelters. "The pattern was established decades ago," he noted grimly. He just needed the right trigger to activate it. In her therapist's office, Elizabeth clutched her wedding photograph, staring at the face of the man she thought she knew. "Who was this man?" she asked, her voice hollow with disbelief. "I lived with him for 15 years, and he was a complete stranger." Later that day, Kevin accompanied Elizabeth back to her house, helping her search for any clues to Gordon's true identity. Elizabeth pointed out inconsistencies that had seemed trivial before: the lack of childhood photographs, his refusal to visit his supposed hometown, his vague accounts of his past. "He always changed the subject when I asked about his parents," Elizabeth recalled, opening a drawer filled with carefully organized documents. "I thought he was just private about his painful childhood. Now I realize there was nothing to tell. It was all fabrication." Across town, the school board meeting grew heated as parents and community members debated proposals for a permanent memorial. Some advocated renaming the school Millfield Memorial Elementary, while others argued that such a change would forever link the institution with tragedy. "Children need to move forward," argued Principal Harris. "A memorial garden might be more appropriate than changing the school's identity." The crowd fell silent when Mary Collins rose to speak, her small frame commanding unexpected attention. "I don't want what happened erased," she said firmly. "I want every child who walks through those gates to know about Tommy and the others, not to scare them, but so they're remembered as more than victims." In his temporary apartment, Kevin sorted through the last of his father's belongings, discovering a shoebox containing dozens of letters Robert had written to Martha after her death. Each envelope was addressed to her in heaven, sealed but never sent, a private conversation with his departed wife that Kevin hesitated to read. David Carmichael, a documentary filmmaker with kind eyes and a reputation for thoughtful work, approached Kevin at the local diner the next morning. "I want to tell the true story," he explained over coffee. "Honor the victims, not sensationalize the criminal. This community deserves to have its story told with dignity." Jim Peterson initially reacted with hostility when Kevin mentioned the documentary proposal. "More vultures picking at our pain," he spat. But later that evening called Kevin back. "If it's done respectfully," he conceded, "maybe it could help other communities recognize the warning signs before it's too late." In the attic of what had been her home, Elizabeth discovered a hidden compartment in an old suitcase containing a set of forged documents: birth certificate, social security card, high school diploma, all created for Gordon Miller's fictional existence. The meticulous planning sent chills down her spine. Sheriff Thomas Dawson, on his first day replacing the retired Mackenzie, found his desk covered with letters from other communities offering support and resources. "The whole country is watching how we recover," he told his deputies. "Let's show them who Millfield really is." Kevin spent an afternoon at the municipal garage, speaking with his father's co-workers, collecting stories and memories to preserve. He always checked the brakes twice, one mechanic recalled fondly, said he carried precious cargo. Lewis Harrington supervised the complete demolition of the barn, each piece of wood removed revealing more evidence of Gordon Gerald's meticulous planning, reinforced foundation, drainage systems, all designed to protect the horrible secret buried below. Elizabeth decided to sell the house, donating a portion of the proceeds to the Peterson Foundation. "Sarah would want her name associated with helping other children," she said softly, "not with what happened to her." On the day Kevin was finally preparing to return to Cincinnati, he received a call from Agent Lowenthal that would completely change his perspective on the tragedy. Additional excavations at the Harrington property had revealed that the shelter mentioned by Gordon wasn't merely a delusion, but an elaborate structure built secretly years before, containing supplies, children's clothing, and a detailed diary outlining plans for a new underground family that suggested the disappearance of Bus 43 might not have been his first plan. Kevin stared at his phone in disbelief. "What do you mean, a shelter? An actual structure?" "We found something disturbing," Agent Lowenthal explained. "Miller, or Mosley, had been working on this for years before the bus incident. It appears he was planning something much more elaborate than we initially thought." 1 year later, on November 17, 1983, Kevin Jennings adjusted his tie in the mirror of his rented apartment in Millfield. The walls, once bare, now displayed photographs of his father, Robert smiling beside his bus, Robert at a school picnic, Robert in his uniform. Kevin had chosen to stay, finding purpose in the community that had meant so much to his father. The small plaque reading Professor Jennings adorned his classroom door at Millfield Elementary, where he now taught history to 10-year-olds with a genuine enthusiasm that initially surprised him. Teaching hadn't been his plan, but when the position opened, something about continuing his father's legacy of caring for Millfield's children felt right. Across the state in Columbus, Jim Peterson shook hands with Ohio's governor as cameras flashed, capturing the signing of Sarah's Law, legislation strengthening background checks for anyone working near schools. The bill represented months of tireless advocacy by the Peterson family, who had channeled their grief into ensuring other communities might be spared similar tragedies. That evening, Millfield's only movie theater hosted a special screening of The Last Route, David Carmichael's documentary about the tragedy. The community filled every seat, many holding hands during the difficult moments. The film had earned critical acclaim for its sensitivity and focus on the victims rather than the perpetrator. In the school library each afternoon, Mary Collins read stories to kindergartners, her gentle voice bringing characters to life, while the photo of Tommy discreetly pinned to her cardigan watched over the proceedings. The children adored Miss Mary, unaware of the profound loss that had brought her to volunteer. Elizabeth Miller made her quarterly visit to Millfield that day, her shorter hair and hardened expression reflecting the changes in her life. She placed a small teddy bear on Sarah's grave before quickly returning to her car, the town holding too many painful memories for extended stays. The memorial at the former Harrington farm had transformed over the year. 11 maple trees, now reaching toward the sky with youthful branches, formed a perfect circle around a bronze plaque listing the names of the victims. The site had become a place of quiet reflection rather than morbid curiosity. Kevin conducted monthly workshops for school bus drivers throughout Athens County, emphasizing the importance of reporting suspicious behavior. "My father noticed something wrong," he would explain, "but didn't have time to act on his concerns. That extra step might save lives." Robert's former apartment had been converted into a small community museum, displaying not just artifacts from the tragedy, but celebrating Millfield's resilient history through the decades. Visitors often commented on how the space managed to honor the past while looking toward the future. Shirley Peterson, the school secretary who first noticed Bus 43's absence, received a commendation for her quick action. "Although we couldn't save them," the citation read, "your vigilance ensured the truth would be discovered, bringing closure to families and community." The new bus number 43, deliberately maintained as a tribute, now featured advanced safety systems including GPS tracking and direct communication with the school. Children boarded it without hesitation, though older residents often made the sign of the cross when it passed. Under Agent Lowenthal's personal supervision, the underground structure discovered on the Harrington property was methodically demolished, its contents catalogued as evidence, then destroyed. The elaborate bunker, with its multiple rooms and stockpiled supplies, revealed the frightening depth of Gerald Mosley's delusions and long-term planning. As evening fell, the citizens of Millfield gathered at the memorial, holding candles in the November chill. Younger residents, who barely remembered the events firsthand, observed respectfully as Kevin read aloud a letter he had written to his father, thanking him for his example of responsibility and dedication. After the ceremony, the entire community walked slowly from the Harrington farm back to town, a procession of lights moving through darkness. No words were needed as they moved together, neighbors supporting neighbors, their shared experience having forged bonds that transcended ordinary community ties. As the lights of Millfield twinkled in the darkness that November night, Kevin reflected on how tragedies don't define communities. It's their responses that do. His father had given his life trying to protect the children in his care, and now all of Millfield carried that same responsibility. To remain vigilant, to question what seems wrong, to protect the vulnerable. That night, passing the school where he now taught, Kevin noticed something he'd overlooked before, a small framed drawing in the hallway, made by Sarah Miller weeks before the tragedy, showing a yellow bus floating among clouds, with the simple caption, "Our bus takes us to safe places." And for the first time in a year, Kevin smiled through his tears, knowing that somehow his father had fulfilled that promise until the very end.